Hi, my name is Boyd Tuttle, and I'm going to give a brief presentation on the Phoenicia expedition that began in 2019, ended in 2020. And I am going to do this fairly quickly because there's a lot of slides to go through and don't have a lot of time, but I think it will be self-explanatory as we go forward. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any further questions you'd like to ask. I am going to be talking about an expedition that took place and that I was a part of, and this is how it all began. April of 2019, I attended a conference and saw this 2-minute video that absolutely changed my life. When I saw that video, I actually felt myself on board that ship when it was going over those waves. And I felt like I'm going to be on that ship. I didn't know why, how, or what, but something told me I was going to be there. And long story short, I was. There was an article that did appear in LDS Living that described what I was about to do. This came out in September, and that's approximately the time I left to begin this expedition. In the article, it proposed that a Latter-day Saint publisher sets out to attempt something called the Mulek expedition, based on my belief that Mulek traveled west aboard a Phoenician sailing vessel. I am working on a book, and the idea is that the Mulek's party came west on a Phoenician ship. Nowhere in the Book of Mormon does it talk about the building of a ship by the people of Mulek, but it does talk about it by the people of Jared, brother Jared, and Nephi, Lehi, but never in the case of Mulek. Who headed up this expedition? A British explorer by the name of Philip Beale, who set out to prove his theory that the ancient Phoenicians could have made landfall in the New World long before the Europeans. And he said, "I welcome Mr. Tuttle to join our crew. It's no pleasure cruise." Well, my point was that I could have sat home and studied this on the internet, or I could do what the ancients did and actually board a vessel that is identical to those that plied the waters 2,600 years ago and see if this is possible and verify it for myself, which is what I did. One of the very motivating people in my life and in this particular experience was Elder Jeffrey Holland, who in a talk that I actually attended live at BYU titled The Greatness of the Evidence, in it he said, our testimonies aren't dependent on evidence, but not to seek for and not to acknowledge intellectual, documentable support for our belief when it is available is to needlessly limit an otherwise incomparably strong theological position and deny us a unique persuasive vocabulary in the latter-day arena of religious investigation and sectarian debate. That was a motivation to me. And why do we do this? We do seek to understand what's gone on in the past. We try to reenact the past. You'll all remember Thor Heyerdahl, the Kon-Tiki, the Ra 1, the Ra 2 expeditions that received a lot of publicity back in the 1970s when he did that. National Geographic featured him on the front cover, the Ra 1, Ra 2 expeditions, which were really exciting at the time. I remember as a youngster reading all about it in 1972. The New Era magazine even ran an article where they interviewed Dr. Heyerdahl, and Latter-day Saint youth talk about what he was accomplishing. It's interesting, though, we don't talk about this much anymore. And the reasons might be because the expeditions essentially failed to establish any real evidence for pre-Columbian New World contact. These reed boats really were not intended or nor capable of making successful trans-oceanic voyages. What changed? So since that time, there has been some significant changes that have come. And the biggest one is this one, the Jules Verne 7. Jules Verne 7 was a shipwreck that was discovered in 1993 off the coast of Marseille, France. And it was investigated and excavated by Patrice Paumet, a French researcher who really is responsible for preserving and recovering this vessel. This is what it looked like when it was brought out and put into a museum. It was remarkably well preserved, considering it was 2,600 years old, preserved in mud, actually. And this shows you where it was and what was left of it and some of the pieces and so forth. Now, this became the basis for the construction of this, a 68-foot long replica of the Jules Verne 7 that was built using the same techniques, using the same wood, the same tools and so forth as by the ancients. And this is actually an example of what the construction techniques that were used that were so well preserved in this early vessel is. We knew exactly the kind of wood that was used in the planking. They also used what's known as a tenon, mortise and tenon technology, where they cut out a gap here, the mortise, and then inserted a tenon made out of walnut, and then held that in place with these dowels, which were made out of olive wood, all of which blended together. As this wood, this pine, sat in the water, it actually expanded as it soaks the water and provides an airtight, watertight seal between the planks that has just been amazing and a fantastic methodology for building these ships. Also, the ship employed the rudder technology that was visible in some of these ancient carvings. And here's a picture of our boat right doing some final repairs on that prior to the expedition. And there's one of the rudders that failed in a previous part of the voyage. And so there was improvements that were made along the way, because it turns out to be there's tremendous forces working against those rudders. This same ship is actually responsible for two different expeditions. The one I was involved was the last one, but originally it sailed in 2008 to 10. It literally sailed 30,000 miles, departing from Southern Arabia, Salalah, Oman, and then traveling around the coast of Africa and eventually ending back up into Syria, where the ship was originally constructed. It's interesting, if you look at this map, they were planning to stop several times up the west coast of Africa, but the wind and the currents actually carried the ship once they left South Africa. It took them very much directly northward and westward toward the Gulf of Mexico. At one point, they were just 3 days away from landfall in Cuba. Now, the second expedition, accomplished by this same ship and the same captain, I might add, is the one that began in September of 2019. This is the one that I was involved in. We departed from Carthage, Tunisia, sailed through the Mediterranean onto the Canary Islands, and from the Canary Islands across the Atlantic, arriving in the Dominican Republic at the last day of 2019. This trip was called the Phoenicians Before Columbus Expedition, which argues that Phoenicians were in America 2,000 years before Columbus. It raises an interesting question when we talk about the Book of Mormon. When did Lehi actually board the ship? Do we know? And is that important? Well, in 1 Nephi 18, we can read that after they had prepared fruit and meat from the wilderness, honey in abundance, and provisions, they did go down and loaded all their seeds and whatsoever. It gives us a strong indication this would have been after the season of harvest, which, being in the northern latitudes, would be in the fall time of year, September, October, November. It also says that they came to pass that after they had taken their provisions, they had put forth into the sea and were driven before the wind. Okay, this ship did not tack. It sailed before the wind, which suggests a single sail type of structure, which is what the Phoenicians had. It's interesting to observe the prevailing winds are very constant and very consistent. From March to August, they blow northerly and east, north and east. But from September to February, they blow very strongly south and west. Well, since they would have left from here in the fall, then the prevailing winds and currents would have taken the ship south and west around Africa. What about Mulek? Mulek is not a name that's found anywhere in the Bible, but according to Hugh Nibley and some writings, the name itself means little king or dear little prince. So the suggestion that he was a young child, which we know had to be the case given the situation surrounding his place in the family, who would have been the youngest. And his father, Zedekiah, was only 31 years old, and he had older siblings. So we know that at the time, Babylon was making their incursions and conquering one city after the next. And eventually they did come to Jerusalem, and they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. And Zedekiah was the king at the time. His real name was Mattaniah, but it was changed by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Zedekiah. He was 31 years old. He had several sons and at least 2 daughters. One of his daughters married an Irish prince just before the siege. Now that's interesting. It could have been, I would surmise, a reason for Zedekiah's wife, or at least one of his wives, to not be in Jerusalem. Maybe she traveled with the wedding entourage or whatever, and it may be why she wasn't captured or caught up in the siege of the Babylonians. We just don't know. We do know from the biblical record that Zedekiah was captured, and his sons and all the nobles with him were captured and then killed at a place called Riblah in Israel. And it's a sad report, but the last thing that Zedekiah saw was the slaying of his own sons. And then his eyes were put out, and he was put into chains and carried back to Babylon as a witness to the end of his kingdom, that there were no heirs left. Well, the Book of Mormon tells us that actually he did have an heir, another son, a son that was either so young or possibly, in my supposition, not even born yet. Had he been born, it would have been a matter of public record, and the Babylonians would have tracked him down. But I believe that he was being carried and preserved in the womb of his mother. They journeyed in the wilderness according to Omni, and were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great waters into the land where Mosiah discovered them, and they had dwelt there from that time forth. They came to their city, Zarahemla, and they never left there. Now, where is the wilderness? They did have to go through the wilderness. They journeyed in the wilderness in order to escape. Well, where's the wilderness? Well, everyone knows in the Middle East, the wilderness is south, the Sinai Desert. That is called wilderness. If you go north, that's not wilderness. And so they could have gone into this direction. They could have gone even further. This is Phoenician-controlled land and territory. Elephantine was a place where there was actually another temple, a Jewish temple, and Jewish garrisons were there. So they had a very likely path of safety on being a wife of the king and having influence and safe passage to those places. It's very likely they could have come here, maybe got to the Nile, down the Nile River, onto a Phoenician ship, and then into the Mediterranean. There's much more we can talk about this, lack of time. Mulek, from Mulek to Zarahemla, what's the route he could have taken? Well, he left here and then sailed across the Mediterranean and either went up. This is where the son-in-law of Zedekiah, Ireland, was from. It's possible that could have gone. Also, there's strong indications that Jeremiah spent time in Ireland, or they could have gone this southern route, the route that we used in our expedition, down to the Canary Islands and then the Canary Islands to the Gulf of Mexico. At the end of the day, they ended up in a place called Zarahemla. Now, is there any Phoenician influence in America? It's a good question, and something that is interesting to observe. We discover in the text of the Book of Mormon that the Mulekites and the people of Mosiah never crossed paths for nearly 400 years. What's also really interesting in my research, I was able to discover that there are Phoenician words in the Book of Mormon. And interestingly, they only show up after these two parties meet. And then we start to see Phoenician words. Well, that's a strong indication that these Phoenician influence was among the people of Mulek, right? So the most obvious Phoenician word is Sidon. Hello, the river Sidon, right? Well, if you look at, Phoenicia, it had two major port cities, Sidon and Tyre. And these are discussed frequently in the Bible in many different contexts. Sidon actually is written this way, right? It reads from right to left, Saidon. There's different ways to pronounce this, but it means fishing port or fishing area. It has a strong indication of fishing is the root meaning there. Now, what's interesting is that when you consider the Mississippi River as possibly being the Sidon River, isn't it interesting that the Lenape have an oral tradition that their tribe migrated east to north in North America until they came to the Mississippi River, which they called the Namei Zipu, the Namei Isi Zipu, which means river of fish. Well, isn't it interesting that the Nephites called the main river that their city, Zarahemla, was on the Sidon River, and that the Native Americans called it river of fish. Also, other indications of Phoenician influence in the Western Hemisphere, interestingly, come from North America. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway is a map actually right here on this one. It's a little bit hard to make out, but this is the Great Lakes here. You can see the outline of the Great Lakes, and you see these dotted lines which represent maps and travel paths. And this writing is Phoenician writing. as is this writing on these tablets here. And these are, to compare, these are actual Mycenaean and Minoan tablets. And when you compare the writing from there onto this artifact that was found in Burroughs Cave, which is in southern Illinois, it's quite amazing to compare these. Well, that's not the only thing. There's also indications of Egyptian influence. Look at these headdresses, which are clearly Middle Eastern and Egyptian in nature, in their design. Even more fascinating, from that same Burroughs Cave in this collection is clearly a Phoenician type vessel with a single mast, single sail, with what are called brailing lines. That's what you see these here, and that is what you'll see in the Phoenicia ship that I was a party to. And here's more of these, many oars and a single sail. The horse head is frequently featured on the fronts of these ships. You can see the rudder effects and so forth. So much detail on these stone carvings, even though it's kind of hard to make out here, but that's what is actually on this stone. And more of the same here, close-ups of the actual Phoenician writing. Here, when I was in Tunisia getting ready to depart, we actually spent time visiting some of the ancient ruins in Tunisia, which are Phoenician and have the Phoenician writing there in Carthage. These are some more artifacts, again, taken from Burroughs Cave, which are fascinating to spend time studying and looking at these. John Welch, in a book called New Information About Mulek, Son of the King, wrote that one son named Mulek escaped, even though the details remain shadowy, since he landed first at the Land Desolation on the East Coast, Helaman, it's found in Helaman and Elma. He probably journeyed to Mesoamerica via the Mediterranean, Atlantic Ocean, and Caribbean, perhaps with Phoenician help. So that I would agree that indeed he did have Phoenician help to arrive. Now, my personal adventure began in September of 2019 in a place called Bodrum, Turkey. And this is a picture of the Bodrum Harbor. And it's interesting because at Bodrum, they have a undersea archaeological museum where a lot of these wrecks that are found, and there are many, when they bring the artifacts up, they send them to this remarkable museum in Bodrum, as you can see where it is relative to Istanbul and the other parts of the Mediterranean. But in this museum, they have many ship cargo pieces, artifacts, and so forth that have been brought up. One of the ones that was most interesting to me was a ship called the Uluburun shipwreck that had a very interesting cargo of a rare 99.5% pure oxides of copper ingots that were found in the hull of the ship. Now, these are the actual copper ingots that were brought out of it. They're called oxides because they're in the shape of an oxide. Actually, they're designed so that two men can carry that with like handholds on these two sides. And it's surmised by some archaeologists that this pure of copper could only have possibly come from one place, and that is Michigan's Isle Royale, where they literally have pure copper veins that come up out of the midst of that island, and that 300 million metric tons of copper were removed in some distant past, and nobody knows by whom or where it went. So there were lots of interesting things and artifacts and studies and research that took place here in the Bodrum Archaeology Museum, which we'll save for another time. Then my next stage of my trip was to return back to Istanbul and then go from there to Lebanon, Sidon and Tyre. Unfortunately, I was denied passage into Lebanon. And the reason for that was because they looked at my passport and I had actually visited Israel within the last 10 years. And no one who visits Israel is allowed to go into Lebanon. I didn't know that until that point. And so I had to reroute my trip, and I was not able to go into Beirut and visit Sidon and Tyre. Instead, I had to advance my travel to Tunisia, which actually turned out to be a great thing because Carthage, Tunisia is an amazing place, some place that nobody ever goes to visit. Nobody's ever heard of it hardly. And I certainly hadn't. And it was just a fascinating place. I could have spent weeks here. As it was, I was able to spend about 8 days prior to the departure of our ship, which was parked here in this little marina. And that's where we did a lot of study and preparation for the sea voyage. I personally had not been a sailor on a ship on the ocean, so we were able to use a little bit of that time to prepare and learn how to raise and lower the mast, how to guide and steer the ship, and some of these things were I was able to learn along with my other shipmates. This is some close-up views of the ship, actually on the very day, the first day that I ever saw it. This is the rear of the ship and the galley exterior. This is the interior of the galley. This is where we spent a lot of time preparing food, eating food, talking about all the different ways that we could eat ice cream, because there was nothing cold. There was no ice chests. Even though you see an ice chest there, the ice only lasted about 1 day, and then everything was warm after that, and everything was saltwater. But this is our sleeping quarters. This is underneath the main deck in the front of the vessel. And you can see there's hammocks. And when that's full, there's about 6 hammocks stretched across there, because at any given time, there's going to be 6 crewmen sleeping and 6 crewmen working the craft. We also spent time making new friends, learning all about the ancient Phoenicians, having receptions with the mayor, and various tours and visits to places like the city of Kirkwan, which is the only wholly intact Phoenician city in the world. We spent time seeing all kinds of amazing museums and artifacts and things that are just impossibly old and amazingly well preserved. These are some of the early glass etchings, and this is in a piece of jewelry by Phoenician artisans. Notice it's very Egyptian in its design, shows the tight connections between that. The Romans in the in the 1st century through the 3rd century AD had a massive presence in Tunisia. And in fact, the 3rd largest Colosseum is found there in a place called El Jem. We went and visited that. It was quite stunning. The Christian catacombs were there. And we spent time traveling and exploring these tunnels under the ground, and finding actual human bones that were left behind. Is really a quite stunning experience. Ancient Carthage was a fantastic city. In its ancient days, it was not it was a very advanced city. It was amazingly well designed. These Phoenicians had incredible technology. They were not a primitive people at all. A lot of times we think, well, it's old, it's thousands of years old, it must be primitive. Well, you can see from these model reconstructions that they've made, this is the Punic Harbor. And in here, you find that they were able to house these ships, and these ships would pull up on these ramps here. And as you can see here and here, these are models of how they would be able to store these ships and then be able to launch them in a very rapid fire fashion when they needed to defend their area or defend other ships. Ancient does not equal primitive. These ramps that were shown there are still there. You can see these are the ramps they would pull the ships up into and then be able to launch them at a moment's notice. They could launch up to 200 warships in 30 minutes. Imagine that. No modern military is even capable of doing that. And these are some artist recreations of the city of Carthage. No primitive thing going on here. This was a very advanced, powerful civilization. These are some of the ruins that we were able to visit. My wife actually was able to join me for about 2 or 3 days just prior to our departure on the ship. This wonderful individual and his family, Ghassan, is the expert, probably the world's expert on Phoenician purple, which is the thing that made them so rich. And if we were going to have that discussion about these mollusks that produce the purple and how it was discovered by the Phoenicians anciently, this would be the place to have that conversation. Just prior to our departure, our Tunisian friends and hosts and guests gathered to send us off. We had lots of preparations on that last day. And then on our departure, our captain, our fearless captain, was actually willing to dress up like a Phoenician king or prince and play the role as we pulled away and finally were at sea. So this is life on board the vessel. We had a 6 hours, 6 hour shifts that governed our every waking hour. As you can see here, every hour we had a different responsibility, from helm to check to lookout to cooking to cleaning to fill in, and that just shifted hour by hour as we go through the shift. Then at the end of our 6 hour shift, we can go to bed, and the other team would then go to work. The last thing we would do is prepare dinner or lunch or breakfast, whatever the shift time was, and so that the shift that's just waking up would then come, they would eat, would make sure they were eating, then we'd clean up after them while they go to work, and then we can go to our rest time. This is what it's like at sea, always traveling west into the sunset. This is a beautiful feeling to have the full sail, to be moving forward at about 5 knots. It's incredible because you literally feel like, wow, this could be exactly what was going on 2,600 years ago as ancient Phoenicians were sailing an identical craft in these identical waters. Life on board ship was always salty. So all the water that we used to wash our clothes, to shower and clean in, and to even wash our dishes was salt water. So we dropped a bucket, we drop this bucket over the side, pull it up and dump it in our pails and containers, and then use them to do our work. The only fresh water was for drinking, obviously in limited supply. There were onboard services, as you can see here, not quite as nice as the ones in this $1 million yacht. Our services were a little more Spartan. However, it got the job done. There was on board a radar that would allow us to see other vessels that would be possibly crossing our path. The biggest danger that we faced were these enormous container ships, these freighters that would travel at 20 knots. And if we were on a collision path with them, we would radio them and ask them to change course. Our ability to change course was quite limited. We did have a time on the voyage that everybody calls the big storm. And it's the one time in the entire 5-month expedition where the ship did not make forward progress. And as we zoom in on it here, you'll see these are actual tracking. There's a tracking beacon on board the ship that puts out a signal every hour or 2 hours. I can't remember exactly. And that is a literal track of our travel. I call this our Jonah and the Whale episode. And momentarily you will see why. The waves became quite large. The wind became very strong. The rain began to fall and lightning began to strike. And I began to imagine, wait a minute, didn't Jonah sail these waters? What was he? Wait. And it really made me rethink my Old Testament stories. And I began to ponder a bit to myself and ask these questions. Did Jonah sail in a Phoenician sailboat? Well, what does Google say? So I actually Googled it, not while I was out there in the water, bouncing and crashing around, but later. And it turns out when you Google what type of ship did Jonah sail, the answer is a Phoenician ship. Why does that matter? Does that even matter? Is it important? Well, it was for me. It talks to a lot of things. First of all, it establishes the historical authenticity of the Bible, and by association, the Book of Mormon. The Lord commands Jonah to cry repentance to the people of Nineveh. He wasn't going to have any of that, and so he wasn't going to go to the people in Mosul, Iraq. That was Nineveh. Okay, he didn't want to go there. So from Jaffa, which is where he was, Joppa, which is modern day Jaffa, on the coast of Israel, he left. Where was he going? He wanted to go to the other end of the world. Okay, well, where's that? He paid a fare and he boarded a Phoenician vessel. Where did Jonah sail? Or when did he? Well, during the reign of Jeroboam II, approximately 755 BC. When were the Phoenicians sailing? Right during that time. Where was Jonah sailing? To Tarshish. Is there such a place as Tarshish? Yes, there is. It's called Cadiz, Spain. So it's quite a remarkable thing when you consider these are real places that are being talked about in the Bible story. And this is the places where Jonah was supposed to go, and he chose to go this way. And ultimately, he didn't make the entire journey, at least not on the boat. Now, there is a condition that many crew members experience under these situations, and it's known as mal de mer, where it has 3 stages. Number 1, I feel sick. Number 2, I think I'm going to die. And number 3, I'm worried I'm not going to die. Well, anyway, that's called seasickness, and it does set in when you get these big, really rough seas. Other than that, I did never have any seasickness on this voyage. We did suffer some damage in that voyage, or in that storm that we went through all that night, and we had a very close call with one of the crew members also almost falling over. Oh yeah, that was me. But he didn't fall over, thankfully. So we were able to continue the voyage, but we did have to limp into with the crew into Algiers. Now, Algiers is a closed country. They don't allow foreigners to come in there. And we found out kind of the hard way, but we had no choice. We had to make repairs. And so in the port of Algiers, we were greeted by many guards and many military people who made sure that we would not going to smuggle anybody or in or out of the country. And believe me, people wanted to get out. It was an amazing time, which I could talk about for a long time, but we did finally leave Algiers after paying a lot of money for that privilege, and continued the voyage. Now, I've mentioned that this ship has taken 2 expeditions, and that's what we're dealing with here. This voyage left from Carthage, Tunisia, and made its way to the New World. This is a short little clip of what it's like to actually sail aboard the Phoenicia. That was about 5 days or maybe a week into the voyage. This is another small clip of sailing. We did have encounters with other vessels and so forth along the way. We had some just footage of plowing through the water here, looking down at the rudder. And this is where you would sit on there, and then you would steer that rudder that I'm holding with my hand. And while you're watching the compass, which is just in front of that. This flag right now is in my den. I have it in the other part. And we were at one time becalmed with no wind. And during that time, as we sat there, we were visited by a pod of pilot whales, which was a fascinating, interesting time. This was our third week into the expedition. Always traveling west. The sun was a guide, as were the stars at night. And I learned a lot about night navigation by stars. We did finally arrive at Gibraltar. The Rock of Gibraltar is a thing. It really is. And it's amazing. Spent several days there studying and learning more about Phoenician influence in Gibraltar, which was tremendous. We did exit through the Straits of Gibraltar, which you have to do. You have a 2-hour window when the water's flowing in the right direction. Otherwise, it's coming in or it's going out with the tide. We did have a bilge pump on board, a manual one that you would pump. The ship did leak. It wasn't absolutely watertight, as almost any ship isn't. And that led to several more days of travel, arriving eventually in Cadiz, Spain. In Cadiz, one of my favorite cities, I will say, we visited museums, university, Phoenician studies, copper ingots, Phoenician art and anchors, lots of amazing things to see here. As are shown in some of these pictures, we were greeted kindly by the mayor, this woman, and some of her staff that came to visit us on board the Phoenicia. This is a picture you saw earlier. This is when Captain Beale was teaching the students in Cadiz about the Phoenician construction techniques. And from here, the ship left Cadiz and went on to Essaouira, Morocco, and from Essaouira, Morocco to the Canary Islands. The Tenerife Marina is here in the Canary Islands. The ship left there on November 24th. And from this point forward, the ship never saw land again until it saw the New World. On the way over, there were some challenges, some problems. The sail itself began to come unstitched in several places, which required repairs at sea. Fishing was successful, as shown here. And that made for really wonderful eating. Showering at sea was accomplished in this fashion. There was a time when the rigging began to fray on about day 28 from the Canary Islands. And that had required some repairs, which meant a bosun's chair and the shipwright being pulled up to the top where he could work on the repairs while the ship is traveling through the water, of course. Thank you, Sudirman. He was an amazing Indonesian who really knew this ship inside and out, and he knew how to fix things. He just had a knack for being able to repair anything with the least of tools and equipment on board that we had. This is a map of the entire voyage. The ship arrived at the Dominican Republic on December 31st, 2019, the last day of the year. And they were greeted there by members of the Dominican Republic Coast Guard, and Philip Beale had to borrow somebody's suit jacket so he could be somewhat dressed formally, even though the sleeves went past his hands. And they were spent some time there, leaving Dominican Republic on January 18th, and then arriving into Fort Lauderdale on February 4th, 2020. I did rejoin the crew at this stage, and I had helped work on the preparation for the arrivals in Fort Lauderdale. And we had quite a reception there with many dignitaries and speakers and mayors and so forth, and Philip and school class children coming to learn all about the Phoenicia. And Captain Beale was ever the great host to love teaching children about life on board ship and the ancient Phoenicians. We even had a wonderful visit from President and Sister Garnes from the mission presidency there in Fort Lauderdale, and that was great. They had a proclamation, and that day, 4th of February, is officially the Phoenicians Before Columbus Day. And so then from there, the ship and the crew traveled to Miami. It was about a 50 or 60 miles south of Fort Lauderdale. And that was quite a reception as well. We had a water salute and coming into the city, into the port. And that was a big deal. The Lebanese community in Miami is very, very active and popular. They were thrilled to have this. They prepared this, what you see here, all these things. They had media there and so forth to greet the crew and Captain Beale and the ship as it came into Miami. So Captain Beale did write this book on regarding the last voyage that the ship made around Africa. And he's working on a new book, which is coming out. I think it just came out literally this month. We're in January of 22. And I think the book has just been released. I haven't seen the final copy. So at the end of it, I ask, did this expedition succeed? And we say, you decide. I would submit that the fact that the Phoenicia made the journey all the way, and this is the Phoenician log, the last day, February 4th, the fact that she made the journey all the way from her last old world port, which would have been the Canary Islands, to America using nothing but wind and current, the entire voyage completed in just 38 days. Absent any of the death-defying drama of Kon-Tiki or Ra-type expeditions, is perhaps what makes this voyage so significant. Phoenicia made the voyage seem almost routine, ready for a dozen more. And so that's the summary of the expedition, and that ends it here with a few questions that I think are worth asking. With all these amazing contributions that the Phoenicians civilization made, that they were later conquered by the Romans, Greeks, and so forth, they were written about in negative ways because they were conquered. So much of their great accomplishments have been suppressed, really, from history. The questions that raises is, will the church scholars and opinion leaders take up the notes and lessons learned from this expedition and examine the merits? Will opinion leaders step up to the challenge of this expedition's claim and confirm the greatness of this evidence? Will the facts surrounding this expedition ever become common knowledge within church membership and among LDS Apologia, much like the Thor Heyerdahl missions were very, very popular and well known by everybody, even though they didn't really accomplish anything? This one actually does. This is a hewn timber ship, the exact kind that was described by Nephi as the kind that he built. Now, quick update, what's happening now? Well, there's a group called the Heartland Research Group who stepped up just recently within the last month and made a cataclysmic decision to purchase the Phoenicia ship. And so the ship is now bound for Iowa. A lot of people say, well, wait, what does Iowa have to do with Zarahemla or Phoenicians? Well, the answer is found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 125, verse 3, and it says roughly, opposite the city Nauvoo, thou shalt construct a city, and the name upon the city shall be Zarahemla, named upon it. Well, is the Lord trying to tell us something? Did Zarahemla in the ancient Book of Mormon times sit on the west side of a major river? Yes, it did. Well, opposite the city Nauvoo, that is the west side of the Mississippi River. And so this Heartland Research Group has been doing a lot of research in that area, and they have discovered that there is tremendous indications of massive civilization on the Zarahemla side of the river and all around that area, actually, of ancient civilization going back about 2,000 plus years. Well, that's important. And it also is an explanation why they want this ship in Iowa. Montrose, Iowa is actually the location of where Zarahemla would have been. And unfortunately, and I'm so sorry to have to say this, the ship itself, after suffering through almost 2 years of being moored in Fort Lauderdale and suffering a hurricane, suffering the sump pumps failing on it, and being literally submerged almost underwater for a long period of time, severely damaged the ship, the seaworthiness of the ship. Philip Beale, undaunted, decided to transport the ship back to England. And so what he did is he had a crew of craftsmen cut the ship into pieces, pack them into containers, and send them to the UK. One container left several weeks ago, and it's on its way to the UK. The whole front of the ship, front half of the ship is in a container arriving in the UK as we speak. The back half of the ship was being cut up and loaded into another container. Well, the Heartland Group purchased the ship and then routed that container to Iowa. And that's what you see here. These are pieces all around this warehouse building of the ship that I sailed over on. It was really heartbreaking to see this, to see the beautiful horse head laying down on her side like this. But she's going to be put back together. She's going to be completely reassembled this summer. And there's a crew that's lined up to do the work. It's amazing the people that have stepped up to do this. I really have to give a lot of credit to several individuals involved in that, to the point that I was actually in Iowa just last week, looking at these plans, which are coming together, which are going to be the museum that will house, these are going to be the museum that will house the Phoenician vessel. And this will be about 100 yards away from the edge of the Mississippi River, so that people will be able to be in Zarahemla and go inside of this dome structure and see the replica of Phoenicia completely as perfectly reassembled for all to see and to witness firsthand. So we like to think that this ship has traveled from Sidon to Sidon, from Lebanon to Zarahemla. And it's truly an amazing expedition. It's an amazing episode of Book of Mormon history to be a part of. And every indication is that this will become a major attraction for people who are faithful, people who are curious, people who are looking for answers. And we believe that this will be a way for them to further their study, strengthen their faith, and increase their knowledge.